why we experience mood swings, why do we experience depression, why do we sometimes feel low while at other times we feel very high. Why does this happen? Have you ever wondered that? It is because of some of the chemicals in our brain. These chemicals are called as neurotransmitters and they help our nervous system and our brain to function. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that carry, boost, and balance signals between neurons, also known as nerve cells, and target cells throughout the body. These target cells may be in glands, muscles, or in other neurons. Billions of neurotransmitters molecules constantly work to keep our brains functioning, managing everything from breathing to heartbeat to learning and even concentration levels. They can also affect various psychological functions like fear, mood, pleasure, and joy. Some common neurotransmitters in the brain and the body include serotonin, dopamine, glutamate, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and endorphins. How neurotransmitters actually work. In order for neurons to send messages throughout the body, they need to be able to communicate with one another to transmit signals. However, neurons are not simply connected to one another. At the end of each neuron is a tiny gap called as a synapse. And to communicate with the next cell, the signal needs to be able to cross this small space. This occurs through a process known as neurotransmission. In most of the cases, a neurotransmitter is released from what's known as the axon terminal after an action potential has reached the synapse, a place where neurons can transmit signals to each other. When an electrical signal reaches the end of a neuron, it triggers the release of small sacs called vesicles containing neurotransmitters. These sacs spill their contents into the synapse, where the neurotransmitters then move across the gap towards the neighboring cells. These cells contain receptors where the neurotransmitters can bind and trigger changes in the cells. After release, the neurotransmitter crosses the synaptic gap and attaches to the receptor site on the other neuron, either exciting or inhibiting the receiving neuron, depending on the neurotransmitters. So, receptors and neurotransmitters act like a lock and key system. Just as it takes the right key to open a specific lock, a neurotransmitter, which is the key, will only bind to a specific receptor or the lock. If the neurotransmitter is able to work on the receptor side, it triggers changes in the receiving cell. Sometimes neurotransmitters can bind to receptors and they cause electrical signal to be transmitted down the cell, which is excitatory. In other cases, neurotransmitter can actually block the signal from continuing, preventing the message from being carried on, which is inhibitory. So what happens to a neurotransmitter after its job is complete? Once the neurotransmitter has had the designed effect, its activity can be stopped by three mechanisms: degradation, diffusion, and reuptake. So the actual identification of neurotransmitters can actually be very difficult. While the scientists can observe the vesicles containing neurotransmitters, figuring out what chemicals are stored in the vesicles is not quite so simple. Because of this, neuroscientists have developed a number of guidelines for determining whether or not a chemical should be defined as a neurotransmitter. Right? So, the chemical, if it is either synthesized in neuron or found in the neuron, then it is a neurotransmitter. Or if it is released in appropriate quantities by the neuron upon stimulation, it is a neurotransmitter. Also, the chemical must be released by the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron must contain receptors that the chemical will bind to. Also, a specific mechanism exists to remove the chemical from its site of activation after the work is done. So how are neurotransmitters actually classified? Neurotransmitters play a major role in everyday life and even functioning. Okay, so neurotransmitters are classified as either excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory are they have excitatory effects on the neuron. That is, they increase the likelihood that the neuron will fire an action potential. Some of the major excitatory neurotransmitters include epinephrine and norepinephrine. Also, there are some called inhibitory neurotransmitters which have inhibitory effects on the neuron. They decrease the likelihood that the neuron will fire an action potential. Some major inhibitory neurotransmitters are serotonin and gamma aminobutyric acid, which is GABA. Also, there are some called modulatory neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are neuromodulators and they are capable of affecting a large number of neurons at the same time. These neurotransmitters or neuromodulators also influence the effects of other chemical messengers, where synaptic neurotransmitters are released by axon terminals to have a fast acting impact on other receptor neurons. Neuromodulators diffuse across a large area and are more slow acting. Neurotransmitters that act as neuromodulators are serotonin, histamine, dopamine, and cannabinoids. right? So this was the basic theory that how neurotransmitters help our brain to function, how they carry the chemical messages among the neurons, and how they give us consciousness. Now we can go into more detailed classification of neurotransmitters in another video. Thank you so much for listening.